All right, we're doing Richard Rodriguez's Aria, Memoirs of a Bilingual Childhood. And this is from a memoir I have not read yet, though I plan to. I think it's sitting in my Amazon wish list somewhere. I do plan to, because honestly, I remember my first semester. As I was teaching, and I was just skimming through the book they'd given me, when they hired me, looking for, I needed some extra essays to teach, and man, it looked kind of good, and I sort of skimmed through, like the way it read a little bit, and I did that anyway with probably about 10 essays or so that semester, and about 3 or 4 of them maybe made it. This was one of them. This might be my favorite one. I think it's a very, it made it into this, the initial anthology I was teaching out of, which was given to often taught in all kinds of colleges across this country. But I hadn't heard. I don't know much about this writer, to be honest with you, and I have not seen this celebrated. I think nearly enough. Because I think this is just an amazing piece. It really is, and just has so many sort of smart things to say, about the immigrant experience, right? And using language to tell that through. And what a vessel he chooses in it, right? And that is, look, if you're going to come to to America, the melting pot, right? You are required to melt a bit, and kind of a lot, actually. And especially if you're a non-English speaking person, you are going to, and there's a very good chance your kids will lose their language, skills altogether. Usually that first and second generation, not so much, but they do a little. Yeah, after that, they all it's fairly common, unfortunately, and it is a bit of a it's a sad sort of thing. It's also kind of inevitable. There's really not much to be done, and this isn't about white supremacy, right? Or a lot of the other problems we talk about often, understandably. But and I do think Rodriguez, and there's another companion piece, Manuel Munoz's "Leave Your Name at the Border." We skipped over that this semester, but that I often teach side by side, and honestly, oftentimes it seems that, or my students actually, that other piece is very sort of on the nose, and how messed up it is, and that basically white teachers weren't saying the kids' names, and he made plenty of points, the fair ones too, but it was just a very kind of a polemic. And just pointing at, it was neat and tidy, and talk about how Latino families often, they start naming their girls Betsy, and their boys, Evan or something, right? And these very Anglicans as sort of names and things. And one of my students, and I can understand reacting to that had at a young age of 18 or so. But I think this is such a deeper and much richer sort of examination of the immigrant process. And we start with, and he uses language itself as his means of interpreting all this, right? And comes up with some really unexpected conclusions. And just written in a beautifully sort of exacting language. And we begin right with this as young Richard is left in a classroom, and his mother sort of disappears, and dissolves away from the pebbled glass door, of the classroom. On very, and again, precise and beautiful, and also poignant, sad sort of image. Right, the poor little boy being left in that classroom, who does not know really much English, and is sort of lost in there. And it had to have been kind of anxiety-inducing, although he doesn't really explain it that way, does it? It seems the words sounded like music to him, and it was just sound. They weren't words yet. And he seems to sort of long for that as he gets older. There was something sort of kind of beautiful about just listening to the tonalities of everyone's speech and not knowing what they were talking about that he sort of enjoyed. And again, this was a guy who was a kid who was going to grow up to be a very good writer. So It might have been that kind of an imaginative and sort of a sensitive kid, right? But what we get established pretty quickly here is, in the home they spoke Spanish, and Spanish was the language of intimacy between them. And it's just a gorgeous idea, right? They were in a very, they moved to a pretty white neighborhood, and again, that white neighborhood not particularly friendly toward them. It seemed like at least the neighborhood, keep your brats off our lawn. That's that's a pretty rude thing to say to people, and that the kids didn't really play with them very much. But hey, he also says, my parents were nobody's victim, and they worked their rear ends off, and they got them into a decent neighborhood, and was fought. Obviously the mother, it seemed like, was a house, so she was able to stay home, which meant that old man was probably working his ass off, the multiple different jobs to keep his family in that house. And again, how is this family sort of represented first? Was it just a really warm family? And so, I think 3 boys in that household, kind of a raucous house. There's things banging around all the time, and it seems like the mother's always got something cooking on the stove, and the father's out, working his ass all day with his hands, right? Doing kind of what human hands were made for, right? He's not out there, sitting in a cubicle someplace. And there's an earthiness and it's just a gorgeous intimacy to this family. When he hears Spanish, it's like he lets his a sigh of relief out, almost like he's home, the language, Spanish was once they got home, that was Spanish, and that was an intimate world that was very different than the public world, where English was spoken everywhere else. And he would talk, listen, it was a little anxiety inducing going to the store, not always being, the guy not always understanding what he was trying to ask for. Coming home, right? And it is beautifully sort of explained here on page, I think 191, if you're reading what I think you're reading. Just opening or closing the screen door behind me was an important experience. I'd rarely leave home all alone or without feeling reluctance. Walking down the sidewalk under the canopy of tall trees, I'd warily notice the suddenly silent neighborhood kids who stood warily watching me. Nervously, I'd arrive at the grocery store, hear there the sounds of the gringo, reminding me that in this not so big world I was a foreigner. But if leaving home was never routine, neither was coming back. Walking toward our house, climbing the steps from the sidewalk. In summer, when the front door was open, I'd hear voices beyond the screen door talking in Spanish. For a second or two, I'd stay, linger there, listening, smiling. I'd hear my mother call out in Spanish, saying, "Is that you, Richard?" Those were her words, but all the while her sounds would assure me, "You are home now. Come closer inside with us." "See," I'd reply. Beautifully, just poignant. The little the passage there by Rodriguez, and we really, Boyd does such a good job of developing that home life and that family, even as a child of an immigrant myself, by the way, but an Irish immigrant and an English-speaking one, and that's very different. But I must say, I still hear the signs of the Irish brogue a little bit, with a wistfulness and in all my writing, I wonder if I'm not trying to sort of, I've often been accused of writing an overly sort of poetic language, and in my forever after lyricism, I always try to create my sentences. I wonder if I'm not trying to recreate something from my lost home, not the language itself, which I've always had, but its music. And there's a certain kind of a musicality to the Irish accent, the Irish brogue that I've lost forever, I think. Something gets lost here forever too, right? And what happens is, young Richard struggles in school, and the nuns are worried about him, and it seems like understandably so. But again, this is a Latino family, very religious family, and boy, those nuns come in there, and they just do you speak Spanish and do you speak English here? Obviously, implying heavily that they ought to be, and the parents are sort of taken back. And again, this is the word of God coming into their house and telling them that is how they're hearing that. I think, and I really do too. I think that was probably close to literal for them, and that from then on, English only, and and what happens after that is this wonderfully warm and really seamlessly sort of a connected family unit starts to sort of break apart, and they're never that close again, or that something died. Something of his writer's childhood dies that day. And oddly, I tell you, it is told where this is the inevitable way of things. You don't get that that kind of tinny, I think to me anyway, tenured, morally tenured, if that makes sense. Bitterness you get sometimes from polemics, and what I think that other piece is sometimes guilty of that I referenced. And this is a both a tragedy and just an evolution, right? They did get their children to the promised land as far as they were concerned, right? And they are, and listen, Mr. Rodriguez is there. He made it into this book, so he's got a chair. He's somewhere earning a pretty decent living, teaching creative writing or something like that. Or and as the family did, get a better life for their children. At least Richard. I don't know what happened to his brothers. But something was, there was a cost, and that cost was that family does kind of start to drift apart, and we see some. There's parents, especially the father, literally sacrifices for his children, right? And we see what happens there, which is that. And we get this, and you see this often. I had a good friend when I was in high school. She was Vietnamese, and I remember her having to go to the doctors with both of her parents. Neither of them. Certainly the mother was really the only one I got to know well, so I think it was both. Anyway, and by the way, they came from they were very well off. They're a bit snobby actually. Yeah, they were very well off where they came from. They came to America with a bit of money. They opened up a dry cleaners, did very well for themselves, succeeded, had no work ethic, had no problem succeeding in this country. Had a very nice house, and it seemed like we're not struggling to live there either. It seems to me they did very well. I know she became a pharmacist, probably, and I think did very well herself. So this was a real success story, but she used to have to go to the doctors and interpret, between the mother and the doctor, for him. And you get this going on, and I think that started probably when she was 10 or 11. And the same thing happens, with Richard, right? He's at the gas station at one scene, and they're at the pharmacy another, and there's a grandmother this happens with too, and there's this sort of odd sort of reversal of dependence that I don't think anybody really likes when that happens, right? That the parents and mothers, I think, have an easier time with this than fathers for the most part, so they'll probably not totally. But they have this reversal of dependence where it's the child that has to lead and help the parents through the world. But boy, that would be that's tough. And it's tough on the kid, and it's tough on the parent too. And we see some of that, and we see one scene, and the parent can't, no matter how, any child at some point is gonna get frustrated and resent that parent, right? A little, which Richard does in this one scene is sort of sad. He sort of, it was a teenage kid at the gas station who was sort of condescending to the father and probably trying his best. But as the young Richard is looking up at this, sort of seeing him as being, talking to his father as if his father was a child, and he sort of was ashamed of him, shrugged his shoulder off and ran ahead of him. And you can tell by the way he's running and how bad. Decades later he still feels, and the guilt he still feels at that memory. And the father, my heart goes out to this poor guy. And again, he had to be working his balls off, this poor guy, right? I mean, by the way, that's me extrapolating. He doesn't actually say this, but yeah, he was. He wouldn't have been able to do what he did otherwise. And he did, man, this guy did okay by his family. He did get them into that house, and again, he gave up a lot to do it. And you see the father becoming less and and there was that one scene where it's described as it went from these noisy sort of affairs to once they were only allowing English in the house, the parents are thinking they were doing the right thing, that it was just sort of silent clinking of forks on plates, and the father sitting there, finishing his meal quickly and sort of sitting with his arms folded and staring out over the heads of his children. And the father suffers other indignities too, right? Their relatives will visit from the home country, and Richard seemed that, and he somehow internalized some sort of anxiety there because he could still understand English or Spanish just fine, and he had fluent listening skills, but he lost his ability to speak it, and he apparently never completely came back, which is kind of shocking. And again, that just sounds like something more more of an emotional issue, a blockage, than it was an actual forgetting of those, especially if he can completely understand it so well. But and you can see why, because some of these, there was one uncle he had. They would sort of, what they call him, a pocho, I think, right, which was the term for anyway, Spanish who's lost his heritage. And boy, that was a grievous insult. That was a serious and grievous insult. I mean, you are somewhat ostracizing, which is a terrible thing. I mean, we have horrible reactions to having that done to us, being cast out like that. From our in-group, and that has evolutionary origins back to survival. Like our Harrier ancestors got ostracized like that. They probably there was possibly a literal life sentence where they would not be able to survive either animals out on their own or whatever the next tribe they ran into. So that it is, you can see why he sort of internalized that, but he very much does. And there's the other scene where I think it was the mother's brother. It's like how shameful it is when children forget their heritage, forget the language of their heritage, and then Richard Rodriguez writes, and he said it. He was speaking to my mother, but I noticed he stared right at my father when he said it. And the father just becomes more and more silent and sort of sullen, and he gets very animated though whenever they have Spanish speaking, their relatives up from the old country. But he's and then the mother becomes also the sort of public voice of the house. And again, this is a kind of patriarchal family, and I'm not, and again, in this era trying to morally saying that's right or wrong or making those kinds of judgments about this, but I think that's the way this family wanted it, and that the mother has to answer the phone when the doctors call or anything like that, or the landlord or whoever, and so I mean he really can't kind of even be the man of the house, and he really seems to suffer a lot, I think, because of this, and oddly, he has a lot to say about bilingual education, which was kind of the rage, has sort of fallen back. That's kind of got beaten back, rightfully so, I think, because the point of bilingual education, and again, a lot of this happened in places like California where they had massive amounts of Latin American immigration, and that it was better to just let kids study math and science and all these things in their native language, and if they're struggling, because put them at a great disadvantage to the other kids because they're English, just because of their English, and one could see the good intentions behind that, but if you're going to live here, you don't learn. And listen, there are places that you could live. When I lived in Los Angeles, which I lived in for a couple of years, there were entire neighborhoods where you would not see an English sign, sort of in East LA. So there were places you could maybe live your life completely in this country. Actually, only speak Spanish, but you know what? You really are boxing yourself in and putting yourself in I think, a grievous disadvantage, and all kids to a great disadvantage when you do do that. And Rodriguez says that himself. And there was one great line, again, exquisitely sort of articulated, where he says, "I had to learn that I had not only the right, which often the right is, the right wing of this country is often attacking. I had not only the right to learn the public language, which was English, but the obligation to do so," which again seems to be the left sort of undermining that sometimes. And what again, just a very sort of mature and wise way, I think, of looking at that. But this does end in a very poignant way. Actually, we do get some. There's an interesting sort of passage on singers and the way they're. Singing is really what brings out so much more meaning and the depth of meaning than the word ever does, right? And then, by the way, even in writing, right, there's a certain rhythm to like. Boy, you read that. We read that Martin Luther King Jr. piece. That thing had a way of singing itself off the page, right? But how singers really sort of understand something about communication that maybe linguists don't, and how he sort of was fascinated by Black English, and again, young, especially in the American inner city, African Americans have and there's been, by the way, they've done studies and things like this where, and all different races of people, and they just, they can only hear, they can't see who's speaking, and you have to guess whether it's a black person, a white person, and they sort of get it right. I think something like 90% of the time, even without being able to see the person, because we are often living within our own sort of a cloistered communities here. There still is a bit of a separation. Plenty of intermingling, we all know, but there's also sort of, and certainly American inner cities have a sort of, a particular way of speaking often, and it's highly stylized sort of English that really it's what became hip hop, right? And probably the most important popular music form in this country in the last 50 years, and how it was the language of intimacy he heard when he heard those black kids speaking, and God, what a brilliant perception that was of him. And again, when you're writing your own papers on it, boy, this is a home run of a perception to sort of notice. And it was both the language of intimacy and in some ways, but there was a real public performative aspect to it, and it kind of fuck you to again. There's that there's always that bit of an anger, and a defiance, just like there's always the hope, right? And especially in African American arts and music, the blues, there's such sad, tragic music, but always makes you somehow feel good listening to it. It's got that cathartic sort of release. Anyway, these kids, it was the language of intimacy. So they were speaking the way they were, so only they would really be clued into it. And by the way, there was an authenticity to that, which, by the way, you hear white kids who try to speak like rappers, right, out in the suburbs, and they often try to dress that way, and they look and sound just ridiculous, right? It is kind of offensive when they do that. And anyway, that was an interesting, I thought, sort of perception there, sort of toward the end, that there was somehow at once the language of intimacy, but sort of with a strident public, again, kind of fuck you to anyone who didn't, how little they cared about who they were offending when they were speaking too loud and carrying on the bus. I guess he was on a public bus or something. Anyway, at last we end here at the grandmother's funeral, and a grandmother he loved, right, and who'd been very nice to him, very good to him, and he's at the funeral. And again, boy, if this doesn't get you a little bit, might want to check your pulse, but as he's sitting and he's looking at her there in the casket, and he's sitting there like trying to figure out, he knew something was familiar, and he realized her face, and the mortician with his dubious art, as he put it, sort of recreated that sort of mask-like face my grandmother had when we went to the drugstore and she didn't understand the language being spoken, the English the druggist was speaking to her, and it was just, boy, just such you get these sort of the depth and totality of the loss, right? That in the casket, the grandmother from the old country who he loved so much, it sort of looks just like she looked, dead as she looked when she was struggling to try to figure out what was being spoken to her, and often had to then rely on her grandson. All right, that is Richard Rodriguez, and we'll talk next time.